Hi, everybody. Welcome to our lecture focusing on blood. So we're going to get started by looking at some of the pictures that depict a sample of blood. So you have on the top, you have basically a category of your red blood cells and white blood cells. So what you see here is your red blood cells, and these ones would be your white blood cells. Right below that, you can see a example of a clot under microscope. So when you form a blood clot, that's basically trapped red blood cells and white blood cells in this network of fibrinogen that basically traps um, the, um, the red blood cells inside and make sure that the bleeding doesn't continue. So again, most of these are going to be your red blood cells, and these basically would be your white blood cells. Here's another depiction in terms of sizes. You can see that your red blood cells are smaller than your white blood cells. And lastly, on the top, you can see an example of a blood sample for somebody who has sickle cell anemia. So here is a normal cell shape for your red blood cell, and this kind of sickle cell shape that we have here, that's an example of a damaged cell. And as we go through the lecture, we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail. So let's go ahead and get started by looking at some of the functions of the blood in our body. So one of the main and most important function of the blood is to transport your gases. Your two main gases would be oxygen or O2 and carbon dioxide, which is your CO2, identified as your waste gas. So the job of your blood through the use of blood vessels is to bring in oxygen to your tissues and collect the carbon dioxide from your tissue. It also transports your nutritional components, including your glucose, your amino acids in terms of protein production. It transports fat or cholesterol. It transports your waste products such as urea, and it also transports essential um, components like hormones throughout your body to the target tissue. Another main function your blood has is regulation. There's two types of regulation they focus on. One is temperature. So it helps, your blood helps with your body's uh, heat or temperature homeostasis. For instance, when the temperature is high in your environment, one of the ways your body deals with that is to dilate your blood vessels and bring a lot of blood to the surface and allow that blood to literally radiate heat to the outside. So typically, if you're in a hot environment, you can see yourself being flushed, and that red color is literally implies a higher circulation of blood to your external environment and allowing that heat to be radiated. Now, if you're in a cold weather, the way your body protects you um, against heat loss is by causing vasoconstriction and limiting how much blood can actually circulate to the surface of your body. So by doing vasoconstriction and limiting your blood supply to the surface, you're also limiting your heat loss as the heat cannot radiate away from your body. Another main function in terms of blood is regulation of your pH. So if you guys recall, your blood pH is 7.35 to 7.45. It's another component that is maintained through homeostasis. And to make sure that it is maintained, within your blood, you have a buffer system called bicarbonate, which is HCO3 minus. And again, this bicarbonate ensures that your blood pH maintains its homeostasis. Lastly, one of the main functions of the blood is defending your body against infective agents. Now, we put all of the infective agents or anything that basically can cause harm to our body under the name pathogen. Now, these pathogens could basically be viruses, bacteria, fungus, parasite, etc. Now, the way your body defends it is using white blood cells or WBCs Um, and one way these white blood cells can defend you is by literally eating up your pathogens and breaking them down to smaller pieces. Is that the only way your body is defended against pathogens? The answer is no. But for now, one of the most important ways it does is by literally eating up those pathogens. Now, what is your blood actually made up of? For us to answer that question, we first need to take a sample of blood and spin that sample using a machine that is depicted up here called a centrifuge. So a centrifuge is basically going to spin your sample quite a few times in 1 minute. And as the sample is spin, the components that are heavier settles down at the bottom, and the lighter components will be forming the top layers. So after you spin a blood sample, you form 3 layers. The top layer of the blood, which is about 55% of the blood, is referred to as plasma. And this layer is mostly water. And basically that's what makes your blood watery or fluid. You have a layer that is typically less than 1% called the buffy coat. And the buffy coat is made up of your white blood cells and platelets. And the bottom 45% is referred to as your red blood cells or your RBCs. So this is about 45%. It is also called a hematocrit layer or hematocrit. And please do note that if you're comparing the red blood cell percentage, or another sense, the hematocrit percentage between male and female, males usually do have a higher red blood cell count. So it can be up to 47%. And the higher level is because they typically have a higher muscle mass and they require more blood to make sure that those muscles receive enough oxygen. Versus when you compare that to females, females have as low as 42% red blood cells in their total blood volume. And again, because their muscle mass are less, and therefore they don't need as much blood. The other component I do want you to know is that the main reason that your body can, or male body can create extra red blood cells and maintain a higher level is the presence of testosterone hormone. So testosterone does play a role in having a higher level of RBC count in case of males. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the 3 layers of blood. Starting with plasma, which is the topmost layer of the blood. It is basically going to be the lightest. The components of your plasma is about 91% water. Again, fluidity of your blood comes from plasma. And the remaining 9% will be basically your ions, such as sodium, potassium, calcium, chloride, etc. Molecules like fat, cholesterol, glucose, proteins, amino acids. It also can contain metabolic waste or nitrogenous waste such as urea and uric acid. And lastly, the component that is helping you maintain your blood pH, which is your bicarbonate, which is again HCO3 negative. Now, that 9%, which we said some of it will be proteins, there are 3 main proteins that are found inside the plasma. Now, first of all, please do note that if I find a protein within my plasma, these proteins are made by your liver. So liver basically makes these proteins, and then these protein gets dumped into your blood to carry a specific function. So among the many proteins you have circulating in your blood, you have 3 main ones that are basically forming majority or almost 100% of your total protein level. The first one, which is about 60% of your plasma protein, is referred to as albumin. So albumin is the most common type. Again, it is produced by your liver, and it's going to help you maintain osmotic pressure by keeping the water within your blood, or more specifically within your blood vessels, and away from the tissue. So if you have normal levels of albumin in your blood. That means that the water is going to be attracted to that albumin and it's going to stay inside your blood vessels. However, individuals that may have liver disease may see a decrease in the amount of albumin your body will be producing. The decrease in albumin level in a person with liver disease will cause a decrease in the osmotic pressure, which means water will move from blood vessels into your tissue and therefore causing tissue swelling, which is also known as edema. So if somebody has you can see tissues being swollen, like in pregnant women, there's a good possibility that the albumin level in these individuals are lower. The second most common type of protein we have is globulin. So globulin is about 36% of your plasma protein. Again, it is very common. It is still made by your liver. And the most important job it has, it acts as a transporter. I kind of refer to them as the taxi or shuttle for your blood. Their job is to transport vitamins, lipids, hormones, and even sometimes act as antibodies. Lastly, we have a group of protein called fibrinogens or fibrinogens. They're about 4%, so again, you can see a significant or drastic decrease in percentage. However, fibrinogen is extremely important for effective blood clotting. So if you do not have enough fibrinogen in your bloodstream, that causes basically severe bleeding in individuals. Now, the bottom layer or the heaviest level layer that we have after spinning off the sample is your red blood cells, which is also referred to as the hematocrit or the percentage of red blood cells. Now, if we're talking about individual cells, they are referred to as erythrocytes. Hopefully, you guys remember the word erythro implies red and cyte means cell. So basically, we're saying red cells. Now, how do we characterize our RBCs? If you take a look at an RBC, which is kind of showing you, doing a longitudinal cut right here for you, these are identified as biconcave, as in they have two kind of deep right at the center. Sometimes I describe them as a donut with a partially formed hole at the center. So the hole doesn't go completely through, you just have that dip right at the center. Why is that present in your red blood cell? The main reason is that that dip actually increases the surface area, and the more surface area you have, the more effectively you can exchange your oxygen and your carbon dioxide with the environment. Now that being basically be tissue or your lungs. So do keep in mind that that biconcave shape is not just there to make the red blood cells pretty, it actually has an important function, which is increasing the surface area for the effective gas exchange. Now, if you take a look at one tiny red blood cell you have, so if you look at a blood sample, typically you will see literally hundreds of them under one field of view of your microscope. If I take one of these red blood cells depicted here, okay, just one single one, and open up this red blood cell, almost majority of the space inside my red blood cell has been taken up by a protein called hemoglobin. Now, hemoglobin is shorthand to capital H lowercase b. And again, if you want to wrap your head around this, one of these tiny red blood cells that are depicted here, one is depicted here, one of these cells contain 215 million hemoglobin. And again, these are proteins. So what is this hemoglobin? So hemoglobin is basically a protein that is essential in terms of carrying oxygen, mainly, and also a secondary role in terms of carrying carbon dioxide. So let's take a look at the structure of the hemoglobin. So what you see as a whole in this structure, that's a hemoglobin. Now, a hemoglobin has three main components. It has these larger units. I'm just gonna kind of show you like a general idea of it. So you can see these kind of four circles or four color structures or subunits of proteins. And basically these red circles that I've shown you are identified as globin units. Now you have two what we identified as alpha globin and two that are identified as beta globin. What is the job of these globin? And these are the protein components that are responsible for carrying carbon dioxide, which is our waste gas. Now, at the center of each of the globin, so you have four globin, at the center of each, you have this kind of a yellow disc on our picture, and these are called heme. So heme is the color component of your hemoglobin. Basically, the color of red we associate with red blood cell comes from this structure which we identified as heme. Now in this picture, they're depicted as yellow. So if I ask you, what is the importance of heme? Basically, it's the color component of your red blood cell. Lastly, at the center of each of your heme, you have these green circles. These are depicting your iron atoms or your Fe. And the job of these iron are extremely important because they carry your oxygen gas. Remember, oxygen gas is needed for your survival. So if you can't have the capacity to carry oxygen using your iron, then you basically cannot survive. Now let's take a look at this, guys. We're saying that each of the red blood cells we have in our body carry 250 million of these hemoglobin structures you see here. And each of the hemoglobin has 4 iron, and they have the capacity to carry oxygen molecules. So technically, the 4 iron carry 4 oxygen molecules per hemoglobin. So 4 oxygen molecule per hemoglobin. So let's look at this, guys. We say we have 250 million hemoglobin proteins per red blood cell, and each of those 250 million hemoglobins carry 4 oxygen molecules. So if I multiply that 4 by 250, you get an answer. 1 billion O2 molecules can be carried by a single tiny red blood cell. Now, this number looks enormous until you think about the fact that every time you produce ATP, you require oxygen, and you have literally trillions of cells in your body. So even though the amount of oxygen per red blood cells look huge, in an overall scheme of things, it's not that many cells. Now, next thing we have is how do we actually transport oxygen? So we have a specific vocabulary that are used to depict when oxygen is bound to your hemoglobin, and another word for when the oxygen has been dropped off from hemoglobin. So if oxygen has been attached to your hemoglobin, it is referred to as oxyhemoglobin, basically oxygen and hemoglobin. Now, the color of these red blood cells that are basically carrying oxyhemoglobin are going to be ruby red. Now, it's not that your blood changes color, it's the way the light hits these cells when they're bound to the oxygen the protein is bound to the oxygen that affects the color. So there is no change per se in terms of the coloring. It is just the way the light is actually hitting the hemoglobin molecules in the presence or absence of oxygen. Now, the next thing that we have is, what if your hemoglobin drops off its oxygen? So as it starts to drop off its oxygen, it's referred to as deoxyhemoglobin. Again, break down the word for yourself. D means lack of, oxy means oxygen, hemoglobin. So basically, it's a hemoglobin that lacks oxygen. Now, this type of hemoglobin, their color would appear as dark red. And basically, what we will see under our skin as a result of light reflection is a bluish color. So you can actually start to see a color coding appearing as we go and move on. Anything that is oxygen rich in terms of your red blood cells nowadays will be identified as a red color. And anything that is lacking or has dropped off its oxygen is referred to as deoxyhemoglobin, and the color of that will be bluish. Now, how do I carry carbon dioxide? So I have talked about oxygen carrying capacity. So how do I carry carbon dioxide? So carbon dioxide is carried through two main mechanisms. One is bicarbonate. Bicarbonate is the main way, or the most effective way of transporting carbon dioxide out of the body. And here is the equation that depicts how your carbon dioxide actually becomes bicarbonate. So I know some of you guys may see this and get overwhelmed even before we go over it, because you see chemistry, and you see chemistry is going to be challenging. So let's just skip that step and say we don't want to make this confusing, so we're just going to keep it simple. So look, we have carbon dioxide, right, CO2, and water. These are basic elements, right? Carbon dioxide, CO2, and H2O for water. And now all I'm going to do is I'm going to combine these two together. So I'm going to have H2, 2 hydrogen, right? 1 carbon, and then 2 and 3 oxygen. So that gives me H2CO3. And again, all I've done is literally add up the carbons for both, adding up the oxygen and adding up the hydrogen. Now, the new molecule that is formed is H2CO3, known as the carbonic acid. But carbonic acid does not stay as carbonic acid. It actually breaks down to hydrogen ion, which is H+, and HCO3 minus, which is bicarbonate ion. Now remember, H is what makes something acidic, right? So I can take this hydrogen and combine it with HCO3 and revert the reaction back to water and carbon dioxide, or take carbon dioxide and water and release hydrogen into my environment. So what is another mechanism that your body carries carbon dioxide? And we have talked about it earlier. It is the amino acid, or more specifically, the protein subunit called the globin subunit. So whenever carbon dioxide binds to the protein region of your hemoglobin, it forms what we identify as carbaminohemoglobin. Again, please start to break down the vocabulary for yourself to make sense of it. CO2 stands for, carb stands for CO2. Amino portion referred to as amino acids, which are basically what my globin is made up of. And lastly, hemoglobin, indicating we're talking about hemoglobin. So I do expect you guys to understand the difference between bicarbonate and carbaminohemoglobin. I do expect you to know which one is more common, which is bicarbonate. And I want you guys to be able to, again, provide the equation and also the breakdown for the terminology carbaminohemoglobin. Okay, I'm going to stop this PowerPoint here, and then we'll continue with production and destruction of red blood cells. And we're also going to talk about the white blood cells and platelets as well.